the day. Please don't be late. Call your friends, I'll call my friends. Let's go and be changed. TMP is doing the most. TMP is doing the most. It's the time of the day. Please don't be late. Call your friends, I'll call my friends.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the Miracle Perspective, and this is the TMP Legends Show. A few weeks ago we started a discussion about racism, a very hot topic in the world. And we had an interview with a white guy who was brave enough to come and talk about what he thinks about racism. And I got a set of questions from another white guy. I'm going to read them to you for you to get a perspective of how this conversation is going to go. So I decided to go and get one guy that I saw, we didn't really meet, but I saw him in university because we were at university around the same time. And he was at the forefront of the Fees Must Fall movement. I'm like, hey man, this guy, THABO, SHINGANGE, he's there in the front of the struggle. Everything is happening and the guy is in the forefront. And I was like, this is the right guy to talk about this at this time. Let me get him on the show. So let me just give you a small background of who THABO is according to his LinkedIn, because this guy is a very interesting man. I'll tell you more about it. But yeah, THABO SHINGANGE is a young dynamic academic and political analyst in South Africa's higher education sector. He has a political science degree, is now doing his doctorate degree. THABO SHINGANGE currently serves as the national spokesperson of South African Union of Students. He has a rich history in student politics, having served as a branch secretary of the South African Student Congress, the SRC president, and one of the activists at the forefront of the Fees Must Fall and Afrikaans Must Fall at the University of Pretoria. This is the THABO SHINGANGE we're talking about. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for taking this interview. It means a lot, man. So, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you don't like to talk about this, but I want you to explain to us who don't know you in your younger ages.
Sure.
When you were in primary school or high school, did you ever think you were going to be the person you are today? Did you ever see yourself as an activist in the forefront of people's issues, serving people?
Funny enough, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I'd always thought of my life as, I'd always said I want people to remember me as someone whose life, as someone whose life has been helpful to humanity. I didn't think of it in that sense within a political sense. I just meant someone who's able to contribute more towards, the common good. It's only in varsity, really. And not in matric, to be honest, when I joined COSAS, it was, high school student political organization and the ANC Youth League. But even then, my involvement was not necessarily as immersed as it is, today. Up until, varsity through the ranks of SASCO, as you were citing earlier, and other, student formations and movements. And I think that created pretty much the conditions that shaped me today. And of course, a lot of life experiences. I mean, my mother losing a job in 2014 also played a fundamental role in changing the way I perceive life, changing the material conditions at home as well. So I think I've had a taste of both worlds, but not both in the sense of wealth, but comfortable and the have-nots, to be able to navigate life quite differently. So I think for me, that has been able to afford me a different lens at viewing life.
Do you have siblings that look up to you, younger brothers or sisters that you're setting an example or do you have any brothers or sisters?
I mean, I have an older sister, so I have one sibling I'm sure of, but then, this is South Africa, our fathers do funny things. But I mean, on a serious note, I have one older sister, yes, from my mother's side. And I'm very particular in that because, yes, a South African story, like many others, I grew up without a father. I know there are other offsprings of him elsewhere, but I've never really gotten to engage with them at that level. So I have one older sister, and that's pretty much my only sibling.
Last question about you before we get to the racism issue. As the spokesperson of the South African Students Union, are you feeling like you are reaching out, or do you feel like the cause that you're fighting for is actually coming into success? Is it looking like things are actually looking positive for the future of the South African youth based on where you are?
I mean, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one, really, because I'm caught between a rock and a hard place in terms of this particular question. Having, for the most part of my life being an activist, for the later part of my life being an activist, and, being a spokesperson in SAWS as a governance structure, finding myself really at the forefront of dealing with the Department of Higher Education, with Parliament, often making presentations in Parliament, meeting up with the minister and so forth, that I have a different picture than the average student. I see a whole lot of other things that, the average student does not necessarily see. And, for the most part, some of these things are not necessarily positive things. It's more like a lot of red tapes that are hindering a lot of progress. So yes, I begin to understand that, okay, the activist in me wants to demand this. But once you find yourself at the, within the bureaucratic system of higher education, you begin to realize that, in fact, this thing is...
It's harder than you thought it would.
No, mind harder. I don't think it's a question about being hard. I think it's a question about political will. But it's far from being realized insofar as will is concerned.
I see.
So it begins to limit. And will is something very subjective. I mean, and another thing about being an activist is that it's unpaid labor. So me advocating for students for the most part is unpaid labor. And the next person really doing the same. The issue really comes when we begin we fail rather to hold each other accountable. And it becomes a tricky one because, I mean, there was a question posed by someone online: are student activists doing enough to serve students currently, to represent students currently? I said, what do you mean? We're all in a lockdown. So am I, because it's a sacrifice, am I sacrificing enough of myself to have, what are you doing, Chief? You understand? So it's one of those tricky ones. But I think where you can choose to serve.
Where you can choose to serve. That's wisdom from the THABO Shingange man. So let's get to the issue of racism. I got a question. This guy said, hey TMP, can you please make a video about racism? I'm a 24-year-old white South African guy and would love to hear your and your viewers' perspective on this topic. My questions are, what is systemic racism and how bad is it in South Africa? Second question, do all Black South Africans still struggle with the after effects of apartheid? Is our government fairer with our laws and regulations than, for example, America and England? Last question, what are some things that white people still say or do that is wrong and racist? Well, actually, lastly, what can we do to change our environment to be more equal and fair towards all races? Thank you for the content you produce and hope the questions don't offend. And that is the reason why I got Mr. Shingange here today. And before we started shooting, we had a discussion where I told him that basically I am not on the popular view of most Black people because I don't feel like racism is still a hindrance to Black people today. That's what I said. And it stirred up conversation. And that is why now I come to Mr. Shingange. Sir, what do you make of the question of racism?
Racism.
Yeah.
I think it's, as you're speaking, I become more and more amazed at the things you're saying, with regards to racism. But yes, I appreciate the fact that I think both you and I clearly share different sentiments with regards to racism. But I mean, let's start from a conceptual understanding of what racism is. Often than not, we throw around this term and we use it quite differently. I mean, how I understand racism may be fundamentally different to how white people understand racism, which is why you see some people say Black people are racist, and I ask myself, what nonsense is that? Or Black people can be racist. So fine, in any case, racism for me is a system of disadvantage based on race. The question was posed in terms of what is systemic racism. Systemic racism can't be devoid from the definition of racism. It's embedded within the definition. It's a system of disadvantage based on race. And to answer the question of whether black people can be racist or not, no, black people can't be racist because black people don't stand to benefit systemically from that. One might be pushed to say, Petrus Motsepe, Cyril Ramaphosa, but those are outliers. They don't systemically or collectively represent the black race, do you understand? Whereas if we were to inverse the racial, variables here, we might arrive at different conclusions. So I think racism for me is a system of disadvantage based on race, of which white people really are at the harm in terms of this.
I get you. I want to ask you a question based on that, but before I get to my personal questions, let's first address the questions of this guy.
Sure.
What is systemic racism? And how bad is it in South Africa?
Yeah, but I think, like I'm saying, the idea of systemic racism and racism as if they're two separate variables. No, racism is in and of itself systemic. So it is a system of disadvantage based on race. Yes, race is a social construct, but racism is a system of disadvantage based on race. So based on race being a social construct. So systemic racism is, when you say racism, we're talking about racism in all its forms, systemic racism in the main. And that's something you find with embedded patterns in institutions, policies, laws, practices, cultures of exclusion. Those are elements of systemic racism, not something that's going to jump into your face and say kafir or God knows what. It is those subtle but yet persistent things that keep the white power structure above.
So, and I'm asking this out of genuine interest to just know and be enlightened. In more practical terms, when we talk about systemic racism, what exactly should, like when a black person gets into any environment, for them to say, actually, this is racism, what are the things that should give signals of that kind of systemic racism?
I mean, a lot of things. Racism happens it's like an iPhone. It releases a version every 2 seconds. A new version just comes out of racism. It's subtle practices. It's subtle things that go on that we've normalized. Superiority, inferiority complexes that we've normalized over time that happen, and also happen only to a particular group of people, when you think about systems, you think about even patriarchy, for instance, how the gender oppression works. It's stupid little things that we've normalized over time and have generalized over time, which are in and of themselves problematic. So it's a question about interrogating around yourself those little things. And I can't tell you what is systemically racist in a corporate firm located somewhere in Sandton. I'm not there. But there are practices probably within that particular firm which constitute various forms of systemic racism.
Got you. So this guy says, do all black South Africans still struggle with the after effects of apartheid? True. That's the next question of this guy.
Miracle perspective, perspective. It's finished.